Kia ora no tātou. Thank you, Denise, for that overview of your mahi. And we know, Denise has been really instrumental in a whole range of mahi. And so this is just one part of it. And so what we'll try and do when we send out the PowerPoints and things to you all is also maybe get a list from Denise of some of the other mahi that she's done in this area to share. The thing about doing this research, as we said this morning, is that it's really important that we work together and that researchers and scholars and practitioners, that we work together across, because those are just kind of constructed silos, right, of definitions. But actually what binds us is being Māori. What binds us is kaupapa Māori. What binds us is that we're all looking for transformation in a context that our people have found ourselves in that was not of our making. And so working together is really, really important, and kind of breaking through this idea of theory and practice somehow being separate is something that's really important to the mahi that we do. I wanted to pick up, so you'll see that this morning when Ngaropi and Lihi spoke, they talked about, one talked about some tikanga elements that came up, and the other talked about the structural elements, and that's how Cheryl and I are going to do this hour as well. I'm going to talk about some of the themes that came, and I'm talking about like a tiny amount of the themes that came up in terms of tikanga, and we want to emphasise a little bit on Maramataka, and then Cheryl's going to talk about the structural impediments of racism and institutional oppression. So, and that's really modelling how culture and structure that Graham will talk about, the cultural components and the structural components all have to come together. And the previous partai around the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and what do we do in the prevention spaces, of which many of us are doing. And sometimes it doesn't appear to be a prevention space, but it is a prevention space. Kura kaupapa Māori kohanga reo was a revitalisation, a regeneration for a particular kaupapa, but it's also a family violence prevention space. The rebuilding of papakainga is not just about housing and homes, it's also a collective obligation. And so the work that Jen and Lotaki and others are doing around that space and housing, Tupuia and others, is also a family violence prevention space. So working across all of our ways of doing things in our sectors is really important, and the ultimate connection is about being Māori and seeking some transformation in the experiences that some of our whānau are experiencing at the moment. We've got a number of preliminary themes that have come out. As I said, we're still writing. COVID put the report writing back quite a lot in terms of time, but these are some general kind of areas of themes that whānau talked about and that Māori working in the field talked about. Everyone that we had hui with and that was shared with us, have some kind of engagement in well-being, whānau, whānau ora. And when I say whānau ora, I'm meaning te oranga o te whānau. I'm not meaning the program, policy, or anything. I'm just talking about the general, which is what we're all about, te oranga o te whānau. So things like tikanga-based definitions, the impact of colonisation, which I'm not going to go into in a lot of depth because it's been talked about by a number of the speakers, but we can take for granted that impact and the knowledge of that impact. Te tiriti o Waitangi, which I'm also not going to go into a lot of depth at this point, but we do know that he talked about some of the literature in the field around te tiriti o Waitangi, but we know, one of the things that we do know is that until there is a real, meaningful, enduring, true pono way of having a te tiriti o Waitangi relationship that is not contractual, not commissioned, not based on Crown or kāwanatanga being dominant, that is a prevention strategy. That's one of our key strategies, is actually the honouring of Te Tiriti Waitangi. And then there are all the tikanga concepts and practices that people talked about, many of which we know. Many are on the values of our organisations or our mahi. They're the mātāpono, or the principles that we live by. They're the tikanga and values that people practice. They're not new, they're old and ancient, and we draw on them in many ways. Tapu, noa, mana, karakia, aroha, manaakitanga, all of those, just for example. Whakarau o the tangata, whakarau o the whānau, so the well-being of the person inside the well-being of the collective. So an individual can be well, doesn't mean that the collective is well, but if the collective is well, all of its individual members can be well. So thinking around that collectively. And then some of the systemic issues, which I'm not going to touch on now, but we will come back when we come back and do the roadshow next year, more of the systemic issues. So there are a range of ways in which people talked about tikanga-based definitions in terms of the impact of violence and family violence, both individually, collectively, both in a cultural way and in a structural way. And what was really clear throughout everything and everyone's kōrero is that the existing mainstream, white stream, whatever we want to call it, stream, Pākehā stream, Crown stream, definitions have always been and they remain inadequate, and that they fail to take into account the impacts of historical trauma, of colonial trauma, that are experienced both as events. So we have colonisation as events, we have iwi, the disposition of lands as events, we have all these events. We can name them in our iwi, we can name them in our hapu, the various events, but colonisation is not just an event, colonisation is an ongoing system and structure. Okay? People talked about violence being multi-layered, all levels of society, intergenerational, structural, systemic, lateral, horizontal, imposed, internalised, individually and collectively. These are how people talked about, our people talked about violence and the need to relook at how violence itself is defined. Violence is experienced as cultural, structural, symbolic, which is, I would think, a big component of the media study that was done. Intellectual, epistemic, so knowledge violence, physical, spiritual, psychological, emotional, mental, sexual. So we're really broadening out, our people really broaden out this notion of violence in terms of, and financial, which has just reminded me we hadn't added that. But these are multiple layers in which violence were talked about by those that shared generously their whakaaro with a whole range of people in the team. The tikanga-based definitions are all-encompassing of all relationships, because an assault on the individual is assault on whānau and whakapapa. The whakaaro Māori in defining violence includes the way in which violence is seen as a violation of tapu, the transgression and violence of all that's held sacred. This is not new. From before the 80s, but also when we see the emergence of Te Kākano, Te Whānau, many of which of you were a part of in the 80s, this was the kind of kōrero, and it's still the same. Our whānau is still saying the same thing around what violation is in terms of tapu and mana. Intentional harm brings violence into a space of power that operates on multiple levels. And I take on board Denise's kōrero around us having to really think about the way in which power is played out in a historical and colonial trauma context. Family violence is the antithesis to tikanga, in particular in regards to how we enact relationships. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are kind of examples of those key points that people made around tikanga based, and you're going to get copies of all of these. But the way in which our people talked about what violence meant as a transgression in terms of all kinds of tikanga, as breaches of all kinds of tapu. So tikanga-based definitions move beyond the act of violence, not solely the act of violence, to a wider impact on all of our lives. Okay? To identify the areas of violation. And this is in some of the earlier work the work done by Roma Balzer in the 90s, the group from HAPE, had this kind of kōrero in it. So this is not new. I think that it's become a wider, more broader conversation now. But that early work really kind of indicated this, and whānau and kai kōrero that we talked to were really reiterating much of what Māori providers have been saying around the way in which we think about violence beyond a singular act into a wider notion of transgression, of mana, of tapu, of mauri, of wairua, all of these concepts. And so when we're talking about how do we stop being the bottom of the cliff, we're talking about reinstating much of this. And I know Ngā Kaitiaki Māori have a lot of this in the framework around sexual violence. So again, a lot of the work we're doing is actually we're reaffirming each other. And that's what we should be doing. We should be reaffirming each other in the way in which we do things, in the way in which we're approaching things. And that's okay to reaffirm in ways that are a little bit different too. Because when we share pūrākau, they're not necessarily all the same version. And actually, our whānau hapa iwi don't really care if someone down the road has a different version. It doesn't make one right or wrong, because the knuckle or the meaning of the pūrākau, the essence, remains the same, even if the actors might change slightly. So looking at definitions around whānau violence must be inclusive of all of these things. That violence and abuse of whenua and taiao is violence against our people. And this is something I think we're becoming more and more cognizant of, but it was talked about again. There was a piece that Miriana wrote in 96, Miriana Pittman, around the rape of Papatūānuku is the rape of wahine Māori. It is one and the same. And that's what colonisation did. So those tikanga understandings of the disposition of whenua and colonisation and the relationship of us to all of those, everything that we whakapapa to is really critical in terms of how we think and talk about definitions. Tikanga as solutions. We said that this morning, we are the solution. Within tikanga are our solutions. There are a whole lot of structural issues that need to be dealt with, sometimes in other ways, but for us, when we're talking about our healing, within tikanga, there are many, many solutions. That does not mean that our people don't have a right to access solutions that align to tikanga. What we don't want is being put in a category where the deficit ideas that Denise was talking about, where our tikanga becomes defined as deficit. Because that is not a ho haere for us, it's a ho riri. So kai kōrero and the thing around voices, in the kind of reports that we write, we try and write as much of voices into what we share. So we hear the voices of whānau, we hear the voice of people working in the field, we hear the voices of our collectives. And, these are all voices of the collectives. And tomorrow, Shirley will share the voices from the survey, which really align to a lot of the entrapment discussion that we've just heard, and that our providers have been arguing against back to the Crown for a very long time. And we think that this is only a beginning piece of work, but there is definitely some data in that survey that we believe will be useful for affirming what kaupapa Māori initiatives are doing and how we see things. So tikanga, as Ngaropi talked about this morning, coming from atua, that being realised, the importance of not seeing atua as single, separated beings from everything else that they are a part of, is a really important point that I picked up this morning in that kōrero, that they are collective. And I've just done this real quick list of some of the kupu Māori that people shared. And you're going to see how long this is. But none of these kupu are new to us. Hu Māori e mahi tahi, mahi tūkino, in terms of describing things. Interestingly, it's mahi tūkino. It's the action, okay? Not necessarily the human being. Mamai, karearoto, kaitiakitanga, all of these kupu are what whānau and those kai kōrero used as examples through their sharing. And you'll get all these, but you can see they go on. Whatu manua, whare tangata, whānau ora, whakawhānui, whakawātea, whakatika, wairangi, moipiro, hā kina kina, whakaro Māori, mātauranga iwi, pūrākau, paki waitara, pāo. All tikanga that we're aware of. That people talked about needing to be brought to the fore in terms of when we're thinking about tikanga definitions. So many of us have these, BJ talked about the mātapono, the principles that underpin the mahi of te puna oranga, and all of these we could fit under many of those principles. Graham's principle of taonga tuku iho in a kaupapa Māori theory and research frame fits every single one of these under. Okay? So we can have a principle of taonga tuku iho, it will fit all of these kaupapa. That's how broad our thinking of our tupuna was. People talked about aroha, and we're not talking about a colonised Valentine's Day, red roses, love, which Ngāropi always reminds me of. Pe aro te hā ki te tangata. Okay? When we're decolonising our thinking, we have to also decolonise the use of the terms that we use. Okay? So when someone has been beaten and says, but they love me, we have to think, how does that fit in ka aro te hā ki te tangata? Or ka haro taku hā ki tō hā? How does that fit in terms of those framing? So aroha was a clear tikanga whakaaro that people talked about, and the challenge of living, because it's hard. We have all been colonised, all of us. We all have remnants of colonisation running around in our whakaaro, in our behaviours, in our practices. And Graham will talk about tomorrow that the greatest revolution of the 80s wasn't kohanga, it was a revolution of the mind. And that's what we're really dealing with in terms of talking about prevention. A revolution of the mind, a revolution of our thinking. And then all of our other structures will come to play from that revolution. But aroha. Tapu. The notion of tapu, the notion of pāharakeke, all of these whakaaro that we know. Whānau is pāharakeke. And we've said this many times, and I've heard many people in this room say this also. Agencies have to stop translating whānau as family. They have to stop acting like the word whānau means nuclear family. They have to stop telling us we can't find one whānau member who will take this child when they're really thinking about family. Because all of the mahi we know is that whānau's been defined in ethnographic and anthropological terms as 3 generations. But actually whānau is as many generations as we say it is, and it's as wide and deep and broad as we say it is. So, and the only people who know who in whānau are available are the whānau themselves. And actually in a lot of mahi that we've done, like this kuia, it's the grandmother, the grandparent often knows where the safe whānau are. So just really decolonising some things, but tapu, safety, tapu noa tikanga are entirely about safety. They're entirely about prevention. Mana, living within mana, recognising mana, which again, we are constantly decolonising ourselves. When we come across things and we come up in situations where we respond in ways that actually don't recognise mana. And then we have to catch ourselves. Everyone is born with mana inherently. Everybody within whakapapa is born inherently with mana. How we live our lives then determines on how we revitalise, how we energise, how we bring that forward, or how we diminish our own sense of mana in relationships. So Mana is really critical from all of these. I'm just really going through these very quickly because I just wanted to share the whakaaro, some of the whakaaro that came. But actually, I want to get to something a little bit faster. Karakia. So Ngāropi said we didn't actually ask specifically about karakia, but we didn't have to. What we did is we said, what tikanga are you aware of that our tupuna did that were healing and could be used as healing? So of course karakia will come forward. And karakia is not something huirangi would say all the time. You don't have to wait for someone else to do a karakia for you. Ko te whakaaro ki ngā atua, ki ngā whakaaro ki ngā tupuna, I roto i a hau, I roto i a koutou. So we all have the capacity to give that whakaaro, even if we don't have the reo. So we don't have to wait for someone else to do those whakaaro to clear spaces for us. In our daily lives I'm talking about. I'm not talking about in ceremonial ritual life. I'm talking about in our daily lives, that it is actually a practice, he would say, that we can do for ourselves. So we don't have to wake up and wait till the 8 o'clock karakia to do our morning karakia. We can wake up and we can do the whakaaro ourselves. So karakia in a daily way, and people are really talking about that in terms of bringing that back in a daily life way. And pūrākau, there was a lot of kōrero about pūrākau this morning. The place of pūrākau, the understandings of pūrākau. Te ohaki o hene, I know, is a critical pūrākau in the sector. In many ways, people talking about that, the way in which we draw on pūrākau. But we have these broader pūrākau that we know are Māori, but we also have our own pūrākau, whānau, hapu and iwi, that have yet really to be brought back often into our own experiences. And so people talked about different pūrākau from their own hapu and their own iwi in relation to atua and in relation to healing. And another thing that often came back was finding the rongoā inside those pūrākau. Jenny writes about pūrākau as being guidance, as being learning, as being teaching, as being pedagogy. So within every pūrākau there are multiple layers of learnings. And manaakitanga. Ka aki te mano te tangata. Fundamentally manaakitanga as kaupapa. And we're going to give a lot of these when we actually write up the whole whakaaro, the whole report. And as I look at it, it's getting bigger and bigger because our people had a lot to say, right, on these. Whakapapa, connectedness to taiao, connectedness to each other, connectedness to tupuna, connectedness to mokopuna, present and yet to come. So when we're thinking about our preventions, we are thinking about those mokopuna, drawing on the whakaaro from our whakapapa that has gone before us into ourselves for the mokopuna that are present and yet to come. One thing that we talked about in the mahi for this last couple of minutes I want to share with you is Maramataka. Now, in the mahi that we'd done around the various research we've done with providers, we had never asked about Maramataka. Specifically, we'd asked about tikanga, we'd asked about pūrākau, mō tiatia, whakatauki, and we have all of those kōrero in this one as well. But we thought as a team, because of the emergence of more knowledge of Maramataka, and I mean the emergence because it's been here, it's been kurahuna in my view. We've had a reason to keep that knowledge to ourselves, and actually some actions of appropriation. Sometimes I think maybe we should have kept that. But what we have is Maramataka growing in our own whānau, our own hapu, our own iwi, our own rohi. And so we thought we'd ask about Maramataka. So, you know, of the kind of, between the hui and the different interviews and kōrero we did, we had over 100, whānau or people, and when we asked about Maramataka, every single person had something to say. And about healing. Does Maramataka have a role in healing? And the thing about that was that was one of the tikanga parts where everyone had something to say about it. Even if it was, I don't know much about it, we're learning about Maramataka, but I do know that we need to know about it for our well-being. So there's a lot of kōrero now that we want to share in this when we do the findings around Maramataka, around living your life in line with taiao, around living our lives aligned with healing. But Maramataka also brought up other things. It brought up things about the food we eat and the impact on the food we eat. And a couple of younger rangatahi in their kōrero talked about the way in which they saw kai as impacting on the young people that they were working with, sugar in particular. And that for them, Maramataka, physicality, changing food, changing diet was really important for people to recognise some physical impact on behaviours. So kai, the question about Maramataka didn't just bring up the Maramataka itself, the Māori calendar. It didn't just bring up kōrero about the marama, the lunar cycles, but also brought up kōrero about mara, about kai, about reconnecting to taiao, about the well-being of being on the whenua, about the impact of not having your whenua to be on and having to find somewhere else to be, around the well-being of being around moana. All of these things came up around Maramataka, around people's moods, around identifying mood swings, around starting to follow the work like Hene Hōtere, following work like Rangi Mātāmua, following the work around Puanga, to identify lunar phases and moods and to think about what you do on that day. So even some of the Māori providers talked about that actually, rākau nui, there's certain things we would do and certain things that we wouldn't do. We started to identify behaviours. And I know now Tūtama Wahine Kitirangi sends out the marama every day for everyone to be well aware of what the day is and of what the marama and the lunar places for us to think and consider our activities for the day. So Maramataka, in terms of whakaaro in this project, I think is probably one of the areas of tikanga that has not been really deeply explored in the family violence spaces. But whānau providers and people engaged had a lot to say about being able to identify what is happening within our environment, within our whānau, within ourselves, the way in which the marama can determine for wahine ikura, so menstruation. And then that brings up conversation about the term menstruation into reo Māori, things like ikura, atua, rerenga atua, the sacredness of that. So there's a whole body of knowledge that can come forward in terms of well-being and in terms of understanding the connectedness that we have as tangata to our broader taiao. No reira. I'm going to leave it there. Just a few, it's a very quick snapshot of a few of the whakaaro. As I said, we'll be sending this out to all of you and we'll be sharing the report out to all of you once it's done. No reira, tēnā tātou katoa.